So hello and welcome. My name is Claudia Newby, and I'm the grad assistant at the Center of Educational Excellence and Equity. And it's within the Graduate School of Education. So thank you for joining us today for our GSOE lecture on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging, which is entitled Deconstructing Disability, a Multi-Generational Family Perspective. So before I get started, I want to do our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that California Lutheran University resides on traditional territory and unceded lands of the Chumash people. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, and pray on their traditional homeland. In their footsteps, we carry forward their tradition of coming together to grow as a community. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Chumash people, past and present. And now I'm going to go into some housekeeping. So before we get started, today's talk is being recorded and will be posted soon on our website as a helpful resource. At the end of today's talk, we'll have time for you to ask some questions, and we do ask that you reserve the chat for questions only, although I was informed that we will use it throughout the presentation. And let me see here, please stay muted throughout the presentation so we can hear our speakers. All right, thank you for bearing with me. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers, Dr. Tammy Bachrach and Dr. Mina Chun. Dr. Tammy Bachrach is a professor of special education at Azusa Pacific University. Tammy grew up in the disability community as a daughter and sister of individuals with intellectual disabilities and was a special education teacher for 13 years. Her scholarly work has focused on family research, including examining the lived experience of children raised by parents with intellectual disabilities. In addition, she has a passion for bridging the gap between disability studies, faith communities, and inclusive faith-based schools. And I'm Dr. Chung. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Learning and Teaching in the Graduate School of Education here at Cal Lutheran. She also serves as the program director for the mild to moderate support needs and extensive support needs credential programs. Her research centers around exploring ways to promote access, equity, and inclusion for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities in our current diverse society. And now, thank you for bearing with me. I'd like to welcome Dr. Tammy Bachrach and Dr. Mina Chun. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Let me get to our next slide. We'd love to know, oh, that didn't advance it, did it? Hold on, let me get back. Where I belong. Oh, maybe it did.
Yes, you did.
Okay, thank you. I can't see everything. If you could put in the chat, it would be great to know what brings you here. If you're a family member of a person with a disability, or if you're a teacher or another interested party, you can just go ahead and put in the chat so we kind of know who's present. Great, good. An advocate, grad student, welcome. Perfect. All right. All right, Mina, do you want to take over for us?
Sure. Let me introduce our study. This particular research study that Tammy and I did was really inspired by a eulogy that was written by the siblings of a man, pseudonym Joseph, who was born with Down syndrome in 1961 in California. At the time when the institutionalization was more popular for individuals with developmental disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. And Joseph passed away in 2021, during when we had the global pandemic. Given the timing of his death, Joseph's sibling could not hold a traditional memorial service. So therefore, instead, they collectively wrote a eulogy for Joseph, reflecting his life and who he was and how he impacted their lives. So this eulogy became the inspiration for this particular study that we did. And Joseph's story, it's not just a story of overcoming the disability, but how he challenged the family's perspective of disability and ableism. It is also a vehicle which is uniquely demonstrated disability history, dramatic, legal, and cultural shift for men or people like Joseph in between 1961 and 2021. So before we dive into our study further, we would like to watch a little short clip in the next slide to kind of give you a brief history of disability.
No legal right to an education, and were either kept at home or were sent to institutions. But in 1817, a man named William Gallaudet created the first special education school, and many more of those schools followed. But while these schools claimed to educate, most of the children were removed from society, and this actually added to the segregation in education. In the mid-1900s, professionals started to see that social interaction between children with disabilities and children without disabilities had a positive impact on education. Even with these viewpoints, parents continued to send their children to mental institutions because they believed that they were the only places that offered the correct training for their child. During the 1960s, the civil rights movement helped prompt the disability rights movement, while people with disabilities fought for equal access to resources in their communities. Along with these resources was a free, appropriate public education for all students with disabilities. The movement led to monumental legislation. In 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, was passed. IDEA required that every child with a disability that affects his or her education would have an individualized education program, or an IEP. The IEP is a document created by a team that states how the child is going to be educated, how the student learns in the most effective way, states short-term and long-term goals, and a plan for graduation.
Right. Let me get to advance. I'm sorry. I can't reach over there. There it is. There we go.
So in the studies in the 20th century, we noticed that there was a shift from the examining family as a cause of disability to ways that disability can disturb the family. Then a majority of studies that we looked at were really on families with children with disability, and really focus on mostly negative effects on the family system and by the disability, including their siblings without disabilities. So there was a limited research definitely has documented the positive contribution to that children with disability make to the family, and also examine the transformation of parents and family views of disabilities. Then in the 21st century, several studies were conducted to understand perception and experiences of families with children with disability, and also including the siblings. For example, Hastings et al. Examined the well-being of families of children with intellectual disability, including the parents and the siblings. And Williams et al. Also examined how a mother, sibling, and child with intellectual disability influence each other's well-being. And other study also looked at the challenges that siblings with of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities experienced and how requested resources different, like across the adult were examined. So there was definitely shift, and there were more parents and families, siblings, all of their voices were heard during that time. But in addition to all that, several studies found that the majority of siblings of individuals, especially with Down syndrome, often experience close relationship, and that the siblings intend to provide direct or indirect support to their siblings with Down syndrome. However, still we noticed that there was a gap remain in understanding siblings and family members' reflection after the passing of their loved ones with intellectual and developmental disability, including Down syndrome. So Tammy and I wanted to address that gap. So this study focused on gaining the richer, multifaceted understanding of the impact of disability on the families by examining their stories, memories, and reflection, the richness following a person they loved. In this project, we are focusing on Joseph, following Joseph's death, and how their understanding of disability evolved through their shared life experiences. So the purpose, go back to this. The purpose of this project is, during the death of an individual typically assure a unique time. So this is really bringing the rich stories of this one particular family, Joseph's family, and how they were able to reflect because of the opportunity that Joseph and the family shared together. And we would like to kind of share that whole spectrum of life from the time Joseph was born until the passing. So in order for us to really look at the rich, deep, robust story of this beautiful, fantastic family, this study utilized a disability study framework, which allowed us to really critically analyze the social, cultural, political dimension of disability by integrating historical practices like medicalization, incorporating insider perspectives, and understanding how the social and cultural perspective have shaped the perception of the disability. So to understand how Joseph's family members interpret and make meaning of their experiences with Joseph, and how Joseph's life has influenced the family members' perspective and perspective of disability. We collected various different data. We first looked at family documents, such as the eulogy written by the Joseph siblings, and also parents' written journals, and also some papers that sibling wrote, and different way that the family reflect in written form. And also we conducted semi-structured interview virtually, because it was during the COVID time, with the 5 siblings of Joseph, and also 2 of his nephews and a niece. And semi-structured interview explored the siblings and their Joseph's nephew and niece's perception and reflection on Joseph's life, and also like major life events and different life transitions they kind of encounter together as a family. The nature of their relationship, and like any significant memories they share together, all those were discussed, shared during those semi-structured interview. And each interview was about 50 to 90 minutes, and it was recorded, and we transcribed it verbatimly, and then also we wanted to make sure we are capturing all the data accurately as possible. So we really wanted to transcribe everything what was said during the interview. So let me give you a little brief, very brief description about our participants. Joseph's mother was present with her written journals, and she was the preschool teacher. And also the father was school counselor, and Joseph's 5 older siblings, 2 older sisters, and 3 older brothers. They were aged between 59 to 66. And then also 2 nephews and 1 niece. They were between ages 30 to 40. So all of them were part of semi-structured interview. And participants, they self-identify as white and middle class. And the family described themselves as a unique, unafraid to go against the grain, and socially minded. Very brief. Once we gather all the written documents and also the transcription from the semi-structured interview with everyone, we went through this process, data analysis process, to really understand and capture the essence of the study, and really wanted to be authentic and be respectful in the process. So it's guided by the 6-phase thematic analysis. So we really looked at all data, read through multiple times so we could all become familiar with it. And then we generalized different codes, and then we grouped the codes, and then we reviewed the codes, and then came up with the themes, and we then defined the themes, and then we create this presentation. And also we recently published a paper. So at the end of the presentation, we create a link and QR code. So if you want to actually read the entire article, you could you will have opportunity to do so. We wanted to make sure that when we are going through the process of data analysis, we are true to the participants' voices. So this study really promoted trustworthiness and rigor through the member checking and triangulation to stay true, like really true and authentic to the our participants' perspective and voices. So they also graciously, our participants review and review our transcription, and then also provide some correction when it was needed, and also when we had some follow-up question, we email them, and they again share their thoughts on it. So they really share many hours of their time with us during this process. So we are very grateful and thankful that we were able to really capture the voices of Joseph's family. And then also before we moving into more deeper into our findings, I want to show, or I want us to read this found poem together, or I will read it to you. This is really drawing from words and phrases from the data that we collected. So all the words that you are seeing on the screen is from our raw data, and to capture who Joseph is. So let me read it to you. Joseph, the most grounded, confident, and happy person, one of the most important people in my life, enrich all of our lives, a model for me, a great role model, a central figure in my life, help to ground me, help make me who I am, help me to see the value of family and caring for people, not just doing things for yourself, taught us to all to love more. So this is using the family members' words, and we wanted to introduce Joseph to you, and Tammy will go deeper into what we have found from this study.
All right, thanks, Mina. So this is a graphic that sort of demonstrates how we organized the data and thought about it. Obviously, a family story has a sequence that can be naturally organized on a timeline. The family lived within this shifting historic context. And so we wanted to talk about what the research said during that time of his life and how some of the legal and political and educational shifts maybe affected the family. As Mina mentioned, we were able to interview the family, but we were really, really fortunate that even though his mom and dad had passed away, this was a family that wrote. And so the mom had journals, and the interview also included that the sister had done during Joseph's adolescence was also recorded and had sort of the ideas of the family at that time, including the dad. So those are the documents that we were looking at. And as I present, I'm going to be sharing with you the most valuable part of this research, which was those quotes that sort of reflected the shift in time and how Joseph impacted the non-disabled members of the family and how their understanding of disability perhaps shifted over time as well. So we've recreated those some of those pertinent quotes with you know, kind of a pseudo voice or AI generated or hooked family and friends into reading the quotes for us, so that it's not the family's voice you're hearing, but a pseudonym. So you will also notice the language around disability reflects the language of the time. So it's not intended to be offensive, but to represent the time period that we're talking about. All right, so we're going to start kind of at the beginning and take a look at the historical context and what the research was saying at the time of Joseph's birth, which was in 1961. He was the youngest of 6 children. His birth predated routine prenatal testing. And therefore, the current, they didn't have the current DNA testing that's definitive now. As a result, he wasn't diagnosed until he was 14 months old, at which time, according to his sister, the family was told that he would basically be a vegetable, and the best course of action was to institutionalize him. That was the most frequently recommended course of action for any children with Down syndrome. The life expectancy for children at that time was 10 years, which is shocking to us now, but that was at the time. And the research at the time really focused on how negative it would be and the negative outcomes that were expected if the family didn't follow that advice, particularly on the family unit, the marriage, and also on the siblings. The risks included emotional neglect resulting from an intense focus on the disabled child, distorted family relationships, reduction of social contact, and increased anxiety and depression were all the kind of the names or the research was saying at the time. All right, so eventually in the journals we find that the mom talked about kind of telling the older siblings about Joseph's disability and her initial reaction to the diagnosis. And so we're going to hear our first clip from that, from her journals from that time period.
Shortly after Joseph's birth, when the doctor blurted out, "He's a mongoloid." By his choice of words, the doctor inadvertently conveyed to me the idea that my son was less than human, since a whole separate classification had been established to accommodate the likes of him. A non-rational feeling, perhaps, but very real, nevertheless. Consequently, during those first few months, while Joseph himself established his own humanity by being exactly like any other cuddly infant, I had to struggle with my own repulsion toward him and toward myself for having produced this presumably non-human creature.
So you see from that clip, definitely that medical model of disability and her initial feelings about Joseph's diagnosis. She, the older sister, remembers a time when her mom told her about Joseph and that he had mental retardation. And she said that she vowed at the time to teach Joseph as much as she could so he wouldn't be retarded. And they also all of the siblings discussed kind of this strong reaction they had about the idea that their brother could be sent away. The family did visit the institution after some time and decided against it. And so if you consider the context of the ominous warnings of the time, you can see a very brave family. I'll give you an example of one of the quotes that's in the research from Adams in 1967. He gives this ominous warning: they, the siblings of retarded children, may grow up as warped in their capacities for self-fulfillment as the retarded child is. So it was within this context that the family made the decision not to follow that the popular opinion of physicians of the time, but to keep Joseph at home. There you go. All right. So that's our first critique, right? Away from that expert knowledge. All right. And then we go into Joseph's childhood and education. And this is certainly a time of lots of change in the US, right? So historically, he grew up right in the midst of the civil rights movement in the US, and several exposés came out about the same time about the conditions in the institutions that kind of gave rise to this deinstitutionalization movement at the time. Even though there was no real community support or educational opportunities during this time, but parents began to advocate much more. And because institutionalization was sort of the only option for support, because only 1 in 5 children with disabilities was even educated in public schools at the time. So you definitely see the context of lack of support. But contrary to this, he actually, Joseph, because of his family situation and their opportunities, because the mom worked at a progressive preschool, he was able to actually have kind of an integrated experience right from the beginning. And eventually the community that he grew up in began to have special education opportunities even before the law mandated it. And so, but you know, there was kind of this report that it was sort of a mixed bag of sort of compassionate people, but not a lot of maybe expectations for Joseph or the other students in the class. Contrary to the research, which warned that raising a child with a disability would restrict extrafamiliar activities and mobility, his family had the opportunity to travel to Europe in a VW bus for 15 months when he was 9 years old. And he was able to attend a school in England for a bit. His closest sibling, who was age 10, remembers their travels fondly and relayed that he and Joseph would go off on his own to play and sightsee arm in arm, and people would wave and smile at Joseph. And the brother stated that he didn't know anything about Down syndrome and just thought, wow, Joseph is such an exuberant and wonderful person that people can just recognize that. And he quotes, he says, it took me a long time to figure out why people everywhere knew that he had Down syndrome. I was looking at him and he was just Joseph. So we see that the brothers' lived experience differed from what was reflected in the siblings' research of the period, which warned about the siblings of individuals with intellectual disabilities having negative experiences, such as feeling embarrassed, and that then affecting their social development and friendships. We also see by the time that he's about 10, his mom writes that I felt it was that we were a very normal family. I'm sure that people do not look at us as being normal. The feeling I have is that other people just look at him and think he is strange looking. To me, he looks normal. And so it's interesting that we see a big shift from the original thinking about Down syndrome, because as the family knew Joseph and he became the brother and the son, the relational identity diminished the disability focus. So early on, of course, when you have a diagnosis and it's a surprising event of having a child with a disability that focuses on that disability and what that means, and eventually that becomes meaningless, even to the point of not recognizing it if you're a sibling, because you don't have that awareness even that there is a difference or a problem to be had here. As Joseph moves into adolescence, that's about 1974 to 1982, we finally do have some movement in the United States. And for the first time, we have a law passed that required that children, all children with disabilities, be educated in public schools. So for the first time, sometimes I think we forget how late that was in how recent that was, I suppose. During the time, the family research expanded, but continued to focus on the causal relationship or connection between disability and damaging the family. So it was still relatively negative, and that continued to dominate through the 70s and the 80s. So that's what the paperwork was saying, right? All the experts were saying. But the lived experience of the family was a bit different. Fortunately, Joseph lived in a location that was better prepared than most to respond to the new law, because they had been providing some special education already. And he was able to attend a typical high school in a special education class. He was able to do, graduation and social outings, and the family expressed high expectations for his future. He also attended a newly developed progressive transition program that focused on employment and life skills. This was a time of great reflection for the family, and Joseph's mother wrote several essays during this time, and Joseph's sister, then in college, read the siblings' research, which differed from her experience. She interviewed family members for a school project and was able to share that project with us. And so we have a few statements from that school project we'd like to share. Sorry, there's always a little bump in here.
His disability doesn't have that much meaning to me. It's just like a difference, but not necessarily a handicap or anything. I am really glad that I've had the chance to have a little brother like him. I don't know, just because of his whole different outlook on life. It gives me a lot of chance to think about how much intelligence matters and whether a deviation from the norm is a bad or a good thing.
Okay, that was one of his brother's reflections. This is sister's.
His disability doesn't have that much meaning to me. It's just like a difference, but not necessarily a handicap or anything. I am really glad that I've had the chance to have a little brother like him. I don't know, just because of his whole different outlook on life. It gives me a lot of chance to think about how much intelligence
I think that everyone, I mean, all the siblings are sort of proud of him. And it's been sort of another thing that makes our family special compared to other families. I don't even recognize the idea that people could be alarmed by him. I think, oh, they'll love him.
All right, so we kind of see during this period lots of conversations and shift in perspective a little bit from the sort of medical model. Living with Joseph challenged the family's values, priorities, and stereotypes about disability. Living with Joseph challenged also during that time, the family speaks about their kind of shifting understanding of intelligence. And so I want to share with you, these are the words from the dad about that perspective.
I think Joseph has given me something to think about. An understanding, a way of looking at intelligence and the importance of intelligence in a very different way. It has put it in perspective for me. And I think prior to that, I thought intelligence was the ultimate value or importance in an individual.
Right. And while Joseph's mother's initial view of disability was one of tragedy, she now acknowledges Joseph's personhood, gifts, and contributions to the family, and stated one of her quotes is, "He just generally enriched our lives." So a really big drastic shift from the original medical model to 18 years later. In one of her essays, she describes Joseph's social and emotional intelligence and his supportive role in the family unit in this quote.
Joseph has a startling sensitivity to the feelings of others. I have discovered that while I am able to conceal my emotions from other family members, I cannot fool him. If I'm distressed, Joseph will pick up on my mood and bring it into the open with probing questions. He acts upon his intuition by providing an extra measure of support by means of a hug or kiss. What marvelous therapy he dispenses.
Joseph's father also reflected on Joseph's role as a role model in the family in this quote.
There are qualities that Joseph has that are a model for me. I wish I had some of the spontaneity and joy out of life, and some of the qualities that, if I wanted to get very philosophical about it, it could give me some things to think about in terms of the goals of life for people. Although he has a dependency on other people and a vulnerability that is a problem for him, I certainly would like to capture for myself some of the qualities he has. I think I could say that he's taught us all to love more.
So we see as the family's idea about disability progressed through their relationship with Joseph, this kind of growing critique and of society's views of intelligence and ableism in the mom's writing. She also wrote of Joseph's reaction to a label of mental retardation, which helped her to begin to question the power of labels and prejudice.
One time I was on the phone with a woman from a well-known organization that aids the developmentally disabled, and I said, "Oh, I'm familiar with your group. My son is retarded." The word retarded flowed easily without emotion, as though I were speaking of a son who was an athlete. Joseph, busy setting the table, stopped short. After a long pause, he asked, "Who is retarded?" Thrust at me unexpectedly, the question clanged in my mind over and over again. I didn't know what to say. "Who is retarded?" Joseph repeated insistently. "You are," I finally blurted out. "Don't you ever say that again. Don't you ever, ever, ever say that again," he said with all the intensity he could muster. I felt heartsick at Joseph's reaction. I chastised myself for not anticipating the possibility that the term retarded, spoken so casually, could be a source of pain to him. I actually had assumed him to be unfamiliar with the word and its conceivably negative connotation. Questions arose in my mind. How did Joseph learn about the word? What pictures did it conjure up for him?
So you can clearly see a shift toward a critique of society also in this quote. I love this one. I'm just going to read it for you. It says, "From my perspective, as the parent of a mentally handicapped child, the problem of retardation lies in many respects less with Joseph than it does with the other so-called normal person. For that person has something Joseph lacks, mainly power. Others have the power to determine the precise quality uh, of life Joseph will be allowed to lead. Often this power is exercised in complete ignorance and prejudice." Here is another quote.
I and other parents have come to recognize that commonly held stereotypes about retardation were erroneous, that given an encouraging environment, mentally handicapped people could develop far beyond the limits previously assigned them. Yet, old attitudes change slowly. The description, retarded, is a powerful one. It has the ability to render invisible all other characteristics in an individual. And yet, watching Joseph and his friends, I'm aware that in many ways, they are mirror images of their unlabeled counterparts, exhibiting the same diversity of personality and capability.
So now let's take a look at Joseph's adult life. During this period of the early 80s through his death in 2021, the beginning in the 80s was the independent living movement. It gained ground, which meant that community sports for people to live in their own home increased. The research developed a more psychosocial approach, and some research began to look at resiliency and how families coped with the stress of raising children with disabilities. At this time, there is an increased, as families had children living in their home, we saw, like Joseph's mom, more writing about their experiences and the rise of parent narratives in the family research. In Joseph's life, what was going on? Joseph's mom was writing about her worries about Joseph's life after her death, which is a common phenomena as both Joseph and the family age. However, there was support in his local community to support him to find work, and Joseph began his 30-year employment history with Polly Pies. So he was an active employee. He was able to move into his own home with the supported living agency. He had a long-term romantic relationship. When Joseph was about in his 40s, his mother passed away. And at that time, most of his siblings and his father moved to other parts of the States. But Joseph decided he enjoyed his work and he enjoyed his home and his relationship and stayed in the local area. He also became Uncle Joseph and played a significant role in family gatherings, holidays, and spent extended visits with his nieces and nephews and family members. So he remained really close to them. One of his siblings still lived in the area and provided kind of advocacy support, but any support that he needed on a regular basis was provided through the supported living agency. Eventually, when we've talked to the siblings or to the nieces and nephews, you'll hear that most of them or all of them were talking more about in terms of his personality than his disability as he became uncle to them. When Joseph retired, he did eventually move to live closer to his family, but he always wanted to have his own place and call his own shots. So he did live near family, but in his own place. At the age of 56, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which is not uncommon for people with Down syndrome. At the end of his life, the family assumed a more direct care role, but elected to respect Joseph and his parents' wishes to not hospitalize or institutionalize him, even at that point in his life, and he died at home with his family. These are some of the quotes or things that were reflected upon from the siblings when they are from the nieces and nephews. Uncle Joseph has been a big presence in our lives. And when they spoke to me and Dr. Chung about Joseph, they spoke in terms of his personality, a man's man, sports lover, competitive, and not to be dissuaded by facts. Guileless, performer, imaginative. So these were the reflections of Joseph. So looking kind of back after someone's death, we certainly see this idea of reminiscing. And Down syndrome was very rarely spoken about. Obviously, it was part of his disability, but when they were reflecting on him and describing him, they said things like, he was a role model to me. He helped shape me. They would tell about things he would say, like, that's life, or I was born lucky, or it wasn't me, not me. And they spoke in terms of respect and admiration for their uncle and their sibling. So what can we draw from this family story? This shift in history, this shift in family perspective. We can see that this study adds to the growing body of literature in family studies that challenges and provides a counterpoint to research that assumes that intellectual disability is a cause of family dysfunction. It demonstrates the power that relationships have to change people's perception of disability and ableism. It also demonstrates the value of political, cultural, and systems changes that have occurred during Joseph's and his family's life. This is not a story about overcoming disability. Joseph lived an ordinary community life. This is a narrative about a family becoming anti-ableist. There's certainly variations in the family view. Even within one family, experiences are not homogeneous and universal. Some family members in his support system elected a more distant role. Joseph's adult life was aided by a lot of person-centered support from a supported living agency, which was really important for folks to live independently with family, but not completely dependent on family. Okay, there was still remained a fear of those with more significant disabilities, possibly overwhelming their family resources. One of the limitations of the study, obviously, is that this was a particular family, and they acknowledged that they had resources, that they could advocate for Joseph and provide additional paid and unpaid support. This was a family who was educated, who was comfortable advocating for the supports that were needed for Joseph to live a full life. So what does this mean for our work? While a total of 187 countries have committed to inclusive education by signing the Convention of Rights of the Disabled, negative attitudes about disability continue to impede full implementation. Employment results or employment statistics remain fairly poor for people with disabilities. And so despite the advancements, these deficit views of disabilities continue to dominate our cultural understanding. Things have improved, but they have not. There still is a lot of ableism that we see in schools and education. And also it's essential to have positive quality of life outcomes for there to be inclusive educational opportunities and strong transition planning to personalized vocational and community supports like Joseph had. Unfortunately, depending on where you live, there remains a lot of disparity about the quality and quantity of those supports in the United States. So many people who could live a full, meaningful life and be not just a recipient of care, but someone who adds to others' quality of life themselves may not have that opportunity still. Joseph and his family story provides that multi-generational perspective and counter-narrative to the medical view of disability that often defines people by the condition of their disability in terms of tragedy, a burden, and their family as at risk. The family's eulogy and reflection on Joseph's life provide a sharp contrast to his birth story and the medicalization of his potential life and identity. Despite the limitations of this research, there remains a startling comparison from the picture on the left of those people who died in the institution and the one on the right where the family is celebrating the life of an individual in their family. A man who lived within the family and who benefited the family. So how can this research, which challenges the dominant view of disability, empower you to affect change in your circle of influence or work? So that's kind of the central question anytime research is done, right? Is to see what does this research mean and how will it go from theory to practice? So what can you do today, tomorrow, in the future to continue the work of this brave family and to use this research? And it's not just this research. Now, if you look at family narrative studies, you'll see a common trend within families to decenter disability into more of a relational experience and see the person as a person. But what can we do? So we'd love to have you apply to the chat and answer the question if you can think about it. What can we do today, tomorrow, or in the future as an educator, as a graduate student, as someone who wants to advocate for people with disabilities, or in whatever role you work or are in? If you want to stick that in the chat, we'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it. We love it to be a little more interactive. Okay, great, thank you. The chat says, today learn more, tomorrow speak up, in the future continue to speak up. Great. Share the awareness for others to be informed, such as hosting events like this one tonight. And joining events is always a good idea to learn from one another. Awesome. Thank you. All right, so we're going to end with what what motivated this research and what started this for us. This is part of what the family wrote in Joseph's eulogy. And I just love the end of this quote. So having Joseph as a member of our family was a great gift, and we are happy that we helped him live life on his terms and to the fullest extent possible. Joseph was the happiest and most self-confident person we know. He taught us that living a rich, kind, and loving life is the end goal. Intellectual ability is insignificant, family is everything, and John Travolta rules. I love that. And then here is access to our full article. You can scan that code if you'd like to have the full article or to share it with others, as one member mentioned.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tammy and Dr. Mina. We'll now take some questions from the audience.
Feel free to put them in the chat or to
That's right.
unmute. It's fine.
Yes.
For a small group.
Okay. I'm still driving. I'm so sorry.
It's okay, no problem.
I'm trying to get onto my laptop, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and just keep doing this from the phone. I'm so glad to see everybody here this afternoon. This is a very, very compelling story. I think there is so much variability within this community that there are maybe similar themes in every story, but no two people even with the same diagnosis display sort of the same issues, even if it's related to ableism or related to employment or whatever it may be. No two lives look the same, and it's so hard to create services that are very unique. And especially, I think the challenge in education tends to be even harder because educational systems are based on this sort of turn of the century industrialization kind of movement. And so I'm wondering, did you find lessons in Joseph's experience? And because I was driving, I missed some of the very early stuff. Is Joseph's family from a different culture, or is this family primarily European American? Because I find that experience also differs in terms of the way that disability is either embraced or understood within certain family dynamics.
Yeah, that's a great question. This family was, white, of European descent. Yeah. Now, the one thing that they would identify, and they were educated, so that was part of the limitation is, you're right, not every family is going to have the same experiences and I think most families will say that advocacy is incredibly important, and how different cultures, view the advocacy or view the expert opinion definitely does differ from culture to culture, for sure. This is also a family, though, that wasn't afraid to go against the grain. That was part of how they explained themselves. They were kind of used to not necessarily going the most popular route. How to say, the parents weren't, at least, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but there certainly is a variation, and those personalized supports are really, really important. As I mentioned, the person-centered planning of the employment agency and the supported living agency was huge. There was a comment by one of the participants also about being alarmed by some of the accessibility, potential movement and accessibility and inclusion by our current administration, president, and that sort of thing. So I wanted to that's from in the chat, that it certainly is really important that people have access to not even there's a sense of institutionalization on a small scale in the community, right? In nursing home kind of places or group home places. And if those are the only options that people have, then this type of full life that Joseph experienced isn't accessible to everybody. So, and we are very dependent on good quality funding and programs so that people, but then again, Joseph then worked. He paid into Social Security. He, he eventually needed less support as he was educated and experienced that life. So. There's also a question about how we chose this particular story to study. So at the time that I received the eulogy, and I received it because Joseph was someone that I knew from the Supported Employment Agency, and in the education, we lived in the same community. And at the same time, I was hearing a lot of stories, as my own story sort of showed, that being part of someone's circle of support and helping them kind of achieve their life goals, there's this idea that you are helping the person, the focused person or the person with a disability. But from my experience and then talking to others who are part of that circle of support, they felt a great benefit. There was a reciprocal relationship. It wasn't a one-way benefit. And so that was part of the thinking and wanting to research what lessons have people without disabilities learned by having these strong supportive relationships with people with disabilities. What benefit do we receive as well? So, and Joseph's eulogy came about at the same time, and I thought this is sort of what other people are saying. So it is actually part of a larger study that we are doing about, from service providers' perspective or families' perspective, about the benefit to each other to have this engaging relationship. And there's certainly many stories during the same time. My family stories somewhat similar in this opportunity to have a rich, rewarding family life that began in the 70s and 80s. And so you do have more of these family narratives that are coming through. But it's dependent on where you live and what your opportunities are for education, and your ability to advocate. There's also a recommendation in the chat of an article called "The U.S. Right is Coming for Disabled People. Here's why that threatens everyone." So, and that's in the Guardian. It's in the chat if you want to grab that. Sandra?
Yes, I just wanted to thank you so much again for sharing this. And I'm wondering, are you geographically, well, I know Azusa, Pacific, and CLU are obviously in CLU. Are your participants also geographically in California, or are they in other places as well?
So this family at the time of Joseph's, childhood, adolescence, and adult life lived in Southern California. Yes. And it happened to be a city that was pretty progressive in its educational opportunities, as well as after. Like, it was one of the very first cities or organizations that was doing supported employment and supported living services and this sort of personalized support. It's much more available now, thankfully, but people actually moved into the city if they had a disabled child for the services. So again, there is this sort of supported community and this really supportive, educated family also. Anything else for the good of the group?
Good. Anyone else?
Thank you so much.
Well, we'd like to thank our speakers once again for such an insightful presentation and everyone who joined us this evening. Once again, it'll be posted on our website shortly. And we want to wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.